So we're back here on Disinformation, the podcast, and it's my honor to introduce you all to our guest today, Mr. Alan Moore. How are you today, Alan?
I'm very well indeed. It's very good to be on the show.
Well, thank you for coming on today. We're going to talk mostly today about Disinformation's documentary, The Mindscape of Alan Moore. We talked to the director of the film, Des Valens, a little bit earlier in the episode, and now we'd like to get some of your reflections on the film and some of your feelings about some of the different subject matters that came up in it as well, especially in regards to the occult and mysticism, as well as some of your forthcoming work. Joe, you want to kick it off with the first question?
Sure. In the film, you talk about growing up in Northampton, and one of the things you mentioned is that you found that art was a way to escape your origins. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, that's certainly true. I think it's probably true of all of us to a certain degree. I mean, I loved the area that I grew up in, but it was incredibly impoverished, at least in material terms, and was one of the most deprived areas in the country. I believe it still is. And growing up there, you found that it did, in some ways, stimulate the imagination, because there was very little around in the conventional sense that would stimulate the imagination. All that we had were, in my early childhood, we had a couple of television programs a week. There were programs on the radio, there were comics, there were books. I joined the library when I was 5. And I think that that world of the imagination was really what it was all about. It struck me, even at that time, I think instinctively, that we live in two worlds. There's an outer world, there's an inner world. There's a material world, if you like, and there's the immaterial world. And the immaterial world of our consciousness is actually, it's the only one that we can say that we really experience. Everything else in perception is kind of mediated through our senses. We're composing reality second by second on this huge loom of our consciousness. And I think that even as a child, I realised that, yes, there's the material world, and that is real. And there is the immaterial world. There's the world of the imagination, and that is real as well. That even if these things aren't real in the same sense as each other, that everybody has got access to a completely different reality. And I kind of exploited that as much as I could. During my childhood, I'd be very drawn to anything that was about the supernatural, or magic, or fantasy, anything which stretched the boundaries of what was possible in the real world. This is one of the reasons why I gravitated so early to the American superhero comics. They were bright, they were fantastic just by originating in America. Certainly the cityscapes in the Fantastic Four and the Flash didn't look anything like the skyline of the area where I was growing up. So even without the superheroes, they were exotic. But yeah, this was very much a kind of a haven for me when I was growing up. Not that I had an unpleasant childhood, but that I really enjoyed having this completely private space inside my head that I could fill with anything I wanted, and that I could visit any time I chose to. That has always been an immense source of pleasure to me, and probably is one of the things that led to me taking up writing and storytelling as a career. It's probably one of the things that led to me becoming a magician.
Is there a particular point where you knew that you would spend your career in this space of imagination?
I think that as a small child, I at first actually wanted to be a superhero. That was at a time when I still believed that that might be possible, and that I might have a quite promising career as a masked vigilante of some sort. I was around about 7 or 8. I got my mum to make me a rudimentary costume, and I'd got a domino mask. Everybody recognised me straight away. So that was probably one of the things that led to me deconstructing superheroes, that actually I realised from an early age that even with the mask on, people still recognise you. I think that around the age of about 9, after this disastrous superhero experiment, that was when I started to think that it might be interesting, if I couldn't be a superhero, to actually be one of the people who wrote or drew stories about superheroes. And I remember doing a comic book, or a series of comic books, when I was in primary school, with a couple of friends helping out, but it was mainly me doing it. These would be just a single copy that would be drawn on just rough paper, that being a notepad bought from Woolworths, be drawn in biro, very derivative. I mean, we were 9 years old, so they were very much reminiscent of whatever Marvel comics I happened to be reading at the time, or stuff like that. But that was probably when I realised, I mean, we wouldn't sell these because there was only one copy of them, so we would hire them out for a penny a time, and we'd send the proceeds, which were less than £1. You know, we'd send the proceeds to a charity. I think it was UNICEF or Save the Children or one of those. I'm sure they were suitably grateful. But the main thing was that doing this stuff, even though they were very crude little exercises, I mean, they were pleasant. They were children's work. But that gave me a taste for expressing myself by telling stories. I think that I was doing similar things around that time, and I think from that point on, I was always involved in some kind of project, many of which fell by the wayside and may only have been school projects, but I was involved pretty continuously in some sort of artistic expression, from those early 9-year-old comic book efforts to the point at which I became involved with the Northampton Arts Lab in the late 60s, early 70s, which for American listeners would be the Arts Lab movement was set up spontaneously all the way across England during the 60s as part of the hippie movement initially. But the idea was that anybody could get together with a bunch of friends or strangers and form an arts lab, which would be, as the name suggests, an experimental arts group that would produce poetry magazines, would put on performances. And so once I'd reached that stage, I was doing cartoon strips for their magazines, I was doing performances, I was writing bad adolescent poetry. But it was a wonderful learning experience. And to answer your original question, I'd say that I probably knew from a very, very early age that the thing that I enjoyed most in life was creating in some way, showing off perhaps. But I've got a minimal ability as an artist. I could write, and I could sometimes do little performances. And I suppose that all of those built up into the the happy position that I find myself in today, where I don't really define myself in any specific terms, where I can more or less do whatever I want as it occurs to me. I can still do bits of performance. I can write comics. I can write seriously intended articles. I can write a novel. I can do whatever I want. So I think the seeds of that were sown very, very early indeed.
When did you start looking at art and your work as in some way magical?
Well, I suppose that the precise period when I understood my work to be magical, in fact, when I understood all artwork or creative work to be in some sense magical, would have to be when I arbitrarily decided to become a magician on my 40th birthday. I think that after that point, I began to realise that I'd pretty much always been involved with a magical process, in as much as it seemed to me blindingly obvious that creativity itself is a magical process. It's taking something out of nothing. It's taking a rabbit out of an empty hat. It's taking an idea out of an empty mind. And then you work at it for long enough, and eventually you'll have something solid that you can hold in your hands, a book, a record, whatever. And I think that realisation incredibly enriched my sense of what an artist or a writer was. Not just me, but potentially everybody. I think that if people understood their art, their craft, as a magical process, I think that they would probably have a really surprisingly strong source of energy and inspiration open to them. It's a funny thing, but as creators, we have a sense that we are at best entertainers. We think that we're lucky if we have a job, whereas in fact we were once regarded as beings of incredible power, because not everybody could use their imagination. And the ones who could were seen in the bardic tradition of magic as being powerful sorcerers. This was purely because of the way that they moved words around and the way that they used words to put ideas into people's heads. And I can't help thinking that if people understood that art was magic and that magic was art, then I think that the current occult scene, such as it is, which is, to my mind, fairly moribund, would suddenly have a purpose. It would be able to produce works of art that would be an indication of the magical territories that it claims to have visited. I mean, one of my favourite artist-magicians is Austin Osman Spare, who was a Brixton visionary who did fabulous automatic drawings that are, as near as damn it, the closest that you're going to get to somebody entering one of these magical spaces and taking a photograph. Now, that isn't actually possible, but if you've got a wonderful artist who can see these things inside their minds, inside the magical space of their imagination, and can then put them down on paper for the rest of us to see, then that is a wonderful combination. And I think that if all of occult society were to actually take that on board, to decide that their output from now on would be seen as magical, yes, but magical in terms of it being artistic, I think that would be of huge benefit to occult society such as it is. I also think it would be of immense benefit to contemporary art, which, again, to my mind, seems largely, I'm speaking here about contemporary British art, or at least some of the most visible exponents of it, but it seems to be largely vacuous and pointless. It's conceptual art but not in any important sense. They're not even properly concepts. They're kind of advertising ideas. They're the kind of things whereby, yes, it's conceptual art. It's like a kind of a joke. And once you've got the joke, there is no point in ever looking at that piece of work ever again. Which is not what art is for, really. Art is meant to endure. So the contemporary art scene, at least here in England, seems to me to be fairly bankrupt. If these creators weren't thinking about the immense sums of money that they were likely to get from their unmade beds or pickled sharks, then they might be instead connecting with something which is much stronger, much purer, much truer, which is the spiritual essence, if you like, of magic, which has run through so much of the art field that the two seem to go together hand in hand. I mean, all of the surrealists were obsessed with magic and alchemy, and were taking a lot of their images from those sources. Even artists like Mondrian was a theosophist, that all of those rectangles were based upon theosophical concepts. People like Picasso, surprisingly modern artists, as well as people like William Blake and the more obviously occult-directed artists of the past. So, in a sense, art and magic have always gone hand in hand. And I think that if people understood that, it could really enrich our culture. Not only our occult culture, but our traditional art scene. It would give people's work some soul in a very real sense. And I think that could only be a good thing.
So we have this idea of the magician and the shaman and the bard kind of going into this this mindscape and coming back with an idea to manifest in the world. And when we're looking at your work, for example, we're excited about the new League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, which is coming out soon, and we've noticed that it's kind of there's a historical progression that's going on that's looking backwards and reinterpreting the world within a certain, I guess, esoteric framework in a way. I'm curious with regards to the magical intent. If all art is magic, what is the magical intent of your upcoming work?
Well, let me see. With something like the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, it's interesting because basically, although it didn't really start out as such, the League has become an exploration of one of the basic ideas that I've come across through magic. It's the idea that the world of the imagination might not be private. It might not be purely personal and individual. That yes, we all do have our individual mind spaces, but that these might link up. There might be some common ground in this imaginary space that we're talking about. And I suppose that with the earlier Lost Girls and with the League, that there is a relationship between the way that those ideas came together and this concept of the world of the imagination as being a single place. I mean, we got the idea, or I got the idea, of putting fictional characters together from Lost Girls. I'd had so much fun with that I belatedly thought maybe this would work for an adventure book. Once we'd got into the League and we started to see how these individual writers' fictions seemed to marry up so perfectly, that these were writers who were separated by continents, by centuries, and yet in many cases they were clearly aware of each other's work and were trying to write sequels to other people's stories, as with Jules Verne when he wrote a sequel to Edgar Allan Poe's narrative of A. Gordon Pym. And all of the little really pleasing linkages that we've discovered in the League, they almost seem to suggest that these writers have, for a long time, been itching to let their creations invade each other's worlds and to make it a huge commonality. I mean, I think I first realised what the League could be when we were halfway through issue 1, and I suddenly realised that I'd got Robert Louis Stevenson's Mr. Hyde having just murdered Emile Zola's Nana on Edgar Allan Poe's Rue Morgue. And I thought that is actually quite cool. Maybe we could make every reference in this entire series into a reference to a previously existing character or place from fiction. And then we kind of I went a bit insane on that in the second volume when we came up with the Gazetteer of Imaginary Places, where we tried to get all of the imaginary places in the fictional world and to put them into rough groupings according to continents and major land masses. Then with the later stuff, with the Life of Orlando, we established a 3,000-year timeline for the fictional world. And this is elaborate and it is obsessive, I'll be the first to admit that. But it is also a really interesting exploration of the world of fiction, which is a world that we've had coexistent with our own since humanity's inception. We've always had our legends, we've always had our fantasy worlds, and we've always had a tendency to try and cross them over. I mean, the story of Jason and the Argonauts is probably the first example of someone thinking, wouldn't it be great if you could have a story where you've got Hercules and Castor and Pollux and Jason, and they're all on a big adventure together and they all know each other. I mean, this has been a tendency since the days of the ancient Greeks, obviously. And the more that we progress with it, the more potential we see in the basic idea. Basically, we can range all over the landscape of the imagination from one end of time to the other. And we probably won't be running out of ideas for that particular series anytime soon. I mean, with other work, one of the main things that I'm doing at the moment is a novel called Jerusalem, which is purely about the neighbourhood in which I grew up. And by extension, the neighbourhood in which any of us grew up. It may not be there anymore, or it may have turned into something very bad, as is the case with my neighbourhood. And what I'm trying to do is to tie the entire of art and language and religion and politics and cosmology and fantasy, to tie it all together and to somehow anchor it in this impoverished little half-square mile of dirt that I grew up in. And I'm about 26 chapters through the book, which was going to be 35 chapters in all. So I'm about 3/4 of the way through. I've got angels, demons, ideas that I've freely taken from my association with magic, and I've kind of mashed these up with family stories, with the history of the neighbourhood, all of these fantastic characters like Charlie Chaplin or Oliver Cromwell, who have cascaded through this place over the years. I've kind of combined them all in a mad fantasy that is trying to explore what this place means, and by extension, what every place means. If you take a place with all of its myths and legends and downright lunatic ideas intact, take it with all of its history, the history of church and state, if you must, and also the history of the ordinary people who lived in those streets. And if you somehow combine all of this together, then I don't know, maybe you can come up with something that is eternal, that is very much like life itself. So, yeah, Jerusalem is certainly exploring a lot of those ideas. There is also the Moon and Serpent Bumper Book of Magic, which is probably the strongest expression of my magical thinking that is amongst the current work that I'm doing. This is something that's going to be coming out from Top Shelf when we get it done, a couple of years at least. I'm working on it with my best friend and mentor, Steve Moore, no relation, who's the man who got me into writing comics, who got me into magic, and is responsible for a lot of the things that have subsequently ruined my life. So I'm working with Steve, and we're trying to create the ultimate grimoire, if you like, or at least our idea of the ultimate grimoire. A grimoire is a big, dark book of spells and magical knowledge. Or it can be many other things. Technically, a grimoire could be a fictional work that talks about magic if it's got enough helpful information in it. A grimoire might be a history of magic, where you're giving histories of the lives of the magicians. It might be a book of theory, or it might be a book of practical spells or magical workings with examples of how to do these. What we've tried to do is to combine all of these things so that we've got something very much in the style of one of the great old Victorian to 1930s era British children's annuals. And we've used a lot of the iconography that I can remember from the England of the 1950s, where, I don't know if it was the same over there, but where we had things like chemistry sets, where you would have a couple of very rosy-cheeked 1950s 10-year-olds, sort of smiling middle-class children, at a table on which there was a Bunsen burner and a selection of test tubes. And those kind of images, we're using them as illustrations because we want this thing to be funny as much as anything else. We want it to represent magic as we experience it, which is not at all the dark and gothic entity that a lot of people seem to want to promote themselves as being a part of. That's not our experience of magic. It's more profound than that. Yes, it does have some very scary edges, and they're part of it, but it's also profoundly beautiful, and sometimes very funny. So we want this book to represent that idea of magic. We've got various parts of the book that run through the entire volume in different strands. There's going to be a series of things to do on a rainy day articles, which will give all the practical instruction that you need, hopefully, to become a practicing magician. There'll be articles of theory. There are a series of articles that are one-page features that are, the overall series is called Old Moore's Lives of the Great Enchanters. And we're having a lot of fun with that. We're starting off with the dancing sorcerer, the image that was found on the wall of Le Trois Frères cave in France. And we're progressing through the entire history of magic. We move from the dancing sorcerer to the Persian Magi. We then move on to people like imaginary figures like Circe and Medea, because, no, they never existed, but they are important archetypes in that they are the first enchantress and the first witch. And these are figures that will be turning up again later in our story. So we move through all of these magicians, real, semi-real, and completely fictional alike. we're making slow progress upon this because a lot of Steve's time is taken up with caring for a very ill brother at the moment. But nevertheless, the work that we're actually doing, we're both really excited about because me and Steve are pretty intellectually smug when it comes to magic. We assume that we know everything. So having to sit down and research these things, we've found out just what huge gaps there are in our knowledge, and I think we've filled them quite interestingly. I mean, we've unravelled the true story of John Faust. I think possibly for the first time, we have worked out exactly where the Faust story comes from, why it came about when it did, and what the original basis of the story was. We've found out things about Dr. John Dee that I don't think anybody else has previously noticed. Namely, that his Enochian angel language, which is one of the most extraordinary things about Dr. Dee's magical work. But we've found out that almost a century before, Paracelsus had been engraving angelic names upon magical vessels, chalices, cups, things like that, in an invented alphabet that he was engraving backwards. So that's interesting. It shows a connection between what Paracelsus was doing and what Dee was doing, and Dee and Kelly must certainly have been aware of what Paracelsus was up to. So it's interesting. We're finding out, we're getting a very broad and vibrant picture of how magic fits together. And we've got less serious things running through it. There's an occult pulp adventure text story called The Soul, which is being illustrated by the excellent John Coulthard. We've got Kevin O'Neill contributing a number of one-page humorous comic strips, a bit like the style of the old British film fun comics, where they'd have the adventures of some current star of stage, screen or musical as a comic strip, Charlie Chaplin or Laurel and Hardy. But we're doing this strip with Kevin telling the story of Alexander of Abonatoicus, who was the creator of Glykon. So that's quite amusing. It's very informative, but quite amusing. Melinda will be contributing a pop-up temple and portable shrine for today's modern Magus on the move. And we want lots of little delightful things in there. I'm going to be working upon a new tarot deck with Jose Villarrubia. We have decided that unless it's as good as Aleister Crowley and Lady Frida Harris's Thoth deck, then it probably isn't worth doing. So we're setting ourselves as high a standard as possible on this, and I think, that'll be an interesting inclusion, a complete tarot deck, all 78 cards, which will be included with the book and which we'll probably make available separately. There's a Kabbalah board game, which should hopefully teach you everything you need to know about Kabbalah, while also being perfectly playable as a board game for all the family. And lots and lots and lots of other things. We've tried to make this the way that you might have imagined a book of magic to be when you were 5 years old and had first heard the word. That you would think that it would be something colourful and wonderful and would have pop-ups, things like that in it. So although we've tried to make this the most comprehensive book upon the subject of magic that has ever been attempted, we've also tried to make it something that would appeal to the 5-year-old child in all of us. And it's interesting to note that, as far as I'm aware, this is the first time in the history of this planet that a grimoire has been produced for mass consumption. I mean, in earlier eras, people like Aleister Crowley or his contemporaries would have been publishing their grimoires for an audience of occultists, a rather small audience of occultists. Today that audience is probably bigger, but is still relatively small. It's not the mass market. There has actually never been a grimoire for the mass market before that was meant to be read by ordinary people and was written in a language that ordinary people might have a chance of understanding. So it'll be quite interesting to see how this goes down. We've tried to be as approachable as possible. We've tried not to scare anybody off. Quite the opposite. We've tried to really engage people in the ideas that we think are central to magic. So it'll be interesting to see when that hits the bookshops, what people think of it, whether they think there is actually something to our ideas of magic or not, because it will be completely up to them to make their own decision. But hopefully there'll be some material in there that any kind of human being could find useful in some way.
I guess a fair number of our listeners are definitely interested in the occult, and I'm sure after hearing that they're just about peeing themselves. But like I am. But I have a question that I just have to ask. You've mentioned before that you've actually run into physical manifestations of characters that you've created, and there's this capricious element of magic when we're attempting to manifest these worlds that we delve into. And you've mentioned that John Constantine has actually showed up in your life at least once. Would you mind?
Yes,
twice
that actually. Once in a physical form that other people could presumably see as well, and once during a magical ritual. They were both very interesting occasions. The first one happened, this would have been sometime back in the early 80s, when I just introduced the character in Swamp Thing, and I was visiting London and was calling into a Sarah Lee's sandwich bar in Westminster, and I was upstairs sitting at a table just eating my sandwiches, drinking my tea, when up the stairs walked John Constantine, basically. It was somebody who kind of looked like Sting, but not quite. He was wearing that fawn raincoat that he was wearing in the comics at the time, and maybe still does for all I know. He was dressed exactly like the John Constantine in the comic books, except for the fact that he was wearing a backpack. But after thinking about it, when I've got John Constantine turning up in all these different parts of the world in Swamp Thing, I suppose a backpack at least would be pretty much prerequisite. So he stood there at the top of the stairs as if looking around for somewhere to sit. I was gaping at him because it wasn't that I was thinking, this is somebody who looks coincidentally quite like John Constantine. It was much more exact than that. I was thinking, that's John Constantine, who is a fictional character that I created. At that point, he looked at me, smiled, winked, and walked off to take a seat around the corner in another section of the cafeteria. And I sat there, slack-jawed and stunned, because there was such an intimacy and a knowing quality in the wink. It was exactly the kind of wink that any fictional character might give to their creator. And I thought, well, there's a way to sort this out. I could just go round there and demand to know whether he's just somebody with a resemblance to John Constantine, who there's a perfectly rational explanation for all this, or I could just eat my sandwich and leave the sandwich bar. And I decided on the latter. I just ate up and I got out of there as quickly as possible, because actually it was kind of disturbing, because this was the first time that I'd had an experience with a fictional character crossing the line into real life. I did hear about other people who had seen people who were writers upon John Constantine at one point who had seen people who seemed to be very, very like John Constantine. The second experience was during a magical experience where I was doing it with some other people, but I just ducked out of the room and popped downstairs to make some tea for myself and the other participants. And I was just passing through the kitchen when all of a sudden, in the darkness on the left side of my head, it's very difficult to describe this, but it was purely as if somebody had struck a match in the darkness, and this lit up the face of John Constantine in the sudden halo of the match flare. And he, in a typically amusing way, told me the ultimate secret of magic, very memorably, in one very short 5-word sentence, then blew the match out and vanished. Now, of course, one of these was a real daylight event. The other one was a purely internal event that happened only within my mind. But they both seemed to be John Constantine to me. So, and that was one of the things that tilted me towards thinking about if there were shared territories between fiction and art on the one hand and magic on the other. And it was one of the experiences that led me to think that there's probably absolutely no difference in those territories at all, that they all connect up perfectly well.
I have an interest in this. I'm not sure if you've encountered these people yet, but they're growing. There's this MySpace community that's becoming more and more vibrant as time goes on, and I'm monitoring their activities. These people identify as real-life superheroes. And we've got people like Angle Grinder Man in London who chops off boots from cars, and Intomo, the Insect Man in Italy, and Mr. Strange and Firefox, and the Spectre over here in the United States, kind of magically oriented real-life superheroes. And these people go around patrolling the streets trying to I guess provide a safe presence, and they do charity work, and they dress up in costume, and they take that fan cosplay idea to a very literal and very manifest level. And many of them describe the Watchmen as a Bible that they live their life by. What would your reaction to these people who are manifesting kind of your vision?
Well, look after yourselves, for God's sake. Don't put yourselves in any danger manifesting my vision. My vision was that actually superheroes in real life could cause more trouble than they prevent. That's not to say that these people aren't working for the very best of motives, and I'm certainly not doubting that. And I suppose that it is kind of interesting to find these ideas, these fantasy ideas, crossing the border into real life. I mean, I noticed that since the release of the Wretched V for Vendetta film, there have been a huge number of people adopting the V for Vendetta mask as a handy token of anarchist anonymity. I mean, there's a group called Anonymous that seems to spend most Saturdays barracking the Scientology headquarters at the bottom of Tottenham Court Road in London. It's interesting to see people taking up your ideas and actually applying them to the real world. So I certainly wouldn't want to say anything against these people. It sounds like they're in for an interesting experience. Whatever happens, I'd just try to tell them to look after themselves. That if there was one thing that I wanted them to do, and if Watchmen really is their Bible, then do tell them to look after themselves, and also perhaps Rorschach was not meant to be a role model. So, but other than that, it does sound very interesting. This is the first I've heard of it, but sounds like an interesting trend. We shall have to see how it develops.
One of the things you mentioned in The Mindscape of Alan Moore is the whole idea. Well, you talk about apocalypse and the idea of a ever-increasing sea of information. Can you talk a little bit about sort of informational apocalypse idea?
Okay, well, where the idea originally came from, I believe, was a French economist who came up with the idea of period information doubling, which is that if you take all human inventions from, say, the invention of the first hand axe, which was maybe, 50,000 years ago, if you took all of the inventions and discoveries that mankind had made from that point up until, say, the year 1 AD. So you've got roughly sort of 50,000 years. And then you see how long it takes for that amount of human knowledge, that amount of inventions and discoveries to double. And it takes about 1,500 years before we have doubled the amount of human information that is available to us. Now, that's quite a speeding up from the previous 50,000. Then it takes only a couple of hundred years for information to double again. And the process continues to speed up. I believe that between 1960 and 1970, information doubled. I believe the last time I heard, and this was some years ago, it was at around about the doubling every 18 months, every 15 months. And there is a projected point in the not too distant future. I thought it was sometime before 2017, that we reach a point where information is doubling every thousandth of a second. And then faster than that. Now, it's just difficult to imagine what human society will be like on the other side of that. It will certainly be very different to anything that we've previously experienced right back to Neolithic times. So I'm not even sure whether it will be survivable, but it would seem a bit wasteful if it wasn't. And looking at culture at the moment, it seems to me as if that general curve that I've described in the Mindscape is holding up. It would seem that we are subjected to a frenetic degree of change in our mindsets, in our economies, in our societies, in our politics. And I think that this is only going to get faster and faster. I think that the best advice that you could give anybody would be to remain flexible, especially in your mind. Presumably flexibility of body wouldn't hurt, but remain flexible in your mind above all, because we are in a landscape now where the only constant feature is change. And I think we have to get used to that, and we have to prepare ourselves to ride the wave, if you like. Alvin Toffler, the futurologist, talked about waves of social change, with talk of agriculture as the first wave to ripple across the planet, and then industry as the second wave. And I think what Toffler described as the third wave, which doesn't really have a name yet other than vaguely post-industrial, has been for some years moving across the world, and it's gathering momentum. And I think that, as with any wave, it's probably best not to try and make it turn back. That never works. King Canute sort of demonstrated that a long time ago over here. I think the best thing to do is to ride it, to see if you can ride it to a workable future, both for yourself and for the planet that we're all on. I think that's the challenge that we have. We are being propelled by this wave of historical change. Nobody's directing this. This is just in the mathematics of our situation. This is just what is happening. It is something that looks like it's been building up for possibly thousands and thousands of years. And it's now reaching a kind of peak, what might be called a phase transition period, where circumstances become so extreme that you're talking about a change from one state to a state that is completely different, like the change from ice to water or from water to steam. That this is what is facing us at the moment, and I think that all of us individually and together have to find a way of navigating this suddenly vaporous territory that we find ourselves in, where our political and economic circumstances can change as easily and as quickly as if they were indeed made out of vapor. So I'd just say maybe people should attempt to ride the vectors of this thing that is happening to us. That is certainly a lot more sense than opposing them or trying to stand against them. Surfers, in some sense, should be good at this, but it's a mental surfing rather than a physical one. You've got to try and catch the wave, and then we've all got to hang on for grim death and hope that we can ride it out. That's my best plan anyway. The only other thing that I've got on the go at the moment is that I'm going to be doing a performance in a couple of weeks at a local pub, the Frog and Fiddler. It's a performance for a Romanian charity called Love Light, which I've been close to for a number of years now. It's an independent charity that was originally set up to rescue orphans from the hellholes that were Romanian state orphanages. And some friends of mine from Wales saw the conditions, which were tragic, and went out there and built an orphanage, built a hospice, because all of these kids, thanks to Mr. Ceausescu's policies, all of these kids have AIDS. And so there's only a certain amount of time that they can remain in the orphanage, after which they were being pretty much put out into the streets to die. So these friends of mine from Wales put together a orphanage, a hospice, and then they built a respite centre for nursing mothers, so that nursing mothers who have AIDS could give powdered milk to their children. The powdered milk was available, but Romania is such a poor country that very often either they, or perhaps more likely their husbands, would sell the powdered milk, meaning that the children would have to breastfeed and would thus be picking up the disease. So anyway, these people, Love Light, have been doing a fantastic job of giving these kids something to live for and setting an example for the rest of that part of the world. So I'm going to be doing about 1.5 hours of performance on Friday the 13th of March at a local pub called the Frog and Fiddler. And I'm going to be doing about 3/4 of an hour of just droning on and talking and my usual stuff. And then we're going to, as if that hadn't sealed my humiliation, I'm going to do 3/4 of an hour of singing as well with a number of musician friends, just working through some of the songs that I've written over the years. So that's in a couple of weeks, and I'm looking forward to that immensely. And if anybody out there can't get along to it, they can always check out Love Light on their websites, and maybe if they're feeling in the mood, sort of sling a couple of dollars to this very worthy charity, But no, that's about all I'm doing at the moment. But no, it's been a very good interview.
Thank you, Alan Moore, for talking to us today. It's been a real honor and a pleasure.
It's been my pleasure all the way. You take care of yourselves, and I shall hopefully talk to you again sometime soon.
We look forward to it. Thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye.